Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, December 18th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump and their bids for the presidency in the 2024 presidential election. Now, Donald Trump has already made it clear that he intends to run for president and has actually officially announced, which we know, he has filed the paperwork and is going full force and fully sending his campaign for the 2024 nomination. Ron DeSantis, on the other hand, as the governor of Florida, has yet to announce a presidential bid to challenge former President Donald Trump. But what we are finding is that with a sudden surge in polling for Governor Ron DeSantis, the chances that DeSantis decides to announce his bid increases, in addition to the fact that Donald Trump's chances at winning the nomination have continuously started to decrease. Now, Donald Trump's showing in the 2022 midterms, and we'll talk about why I refer to it as his showing, was quite cataclysmic. Donald Trump was the main sayer into who was nominated on the Republican side in many of these important congressional and Senate and gubernatorial races that we looked at in 2022. Many of them lost their general elections. Candidates that come to mind are Dr. Oz from Pennsylvania, who lost by 5 points against Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, or Herschel Walker, who lost to Reverend Raphael Warnock by 2 points in the Georgia runoff election, or Blake Masters, who lost to Senator Mark Kelly by a margin of 5 points across the state of Arizona. Candidates like those, the ones who were propelled to victory in their Republican primaries by President Donald Trump, ultimately ended up losing their general elections with very few exceptions in these competitive races. When it comes down to House elections, the Republicans did end up winning control, but when it comes down to some of the more important candidates and some of the more important races, ultimately, Donald Trump's endorsement ended up being a kiss of death for some of these candidates when it came down to the general election. Not that the Trump endorsement pushed voters away from them, but rather the Trump endorsement propelled these right-wing candidates who never were going to win the general election to victory in their Republican primaries. States now such as Alaska and New Mexico are now more Democrat than they have been before, and ultimately, Democrats did quite well in regions of this country that they were expected to lose tremendously. The overall takeaway from these House elections, Democrats did significantly better than expected, and it's something that has a common denominator at Donald Trump being the endorser in many of these Republican primaries. In addition to that, we have that on the governor level. Carrie Lake comes to mind in Georgia. A lot of these candidates come to mind when it comes down to competitive races. What did Donald Trump's endorsement do? Propelled them to victory, but what happened? It made them lose the general election. So now that we have that backstory, Donald Trump doesn't exactly go into 2024 with this overall mandate that I think he expected to go into. But what we have found in recent polls is that Donald Trump is still, at least on the surface level, secure in his chances at winning renomination. When he's faced up against a number of other potential contenders, he actually defeats them by some pretty exceptional margins. But what we know about this group is that when you actually narrow up the vote between one other candidate, notably Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump either loses or barely scrapes by. Not exactly the best news for someone who served in this position for the past 2 elections. I will also say that this was a point that I made very early on when we looked at the preliminary 2024 polling data for President Trump. That when there were voters that were saying that they would consider either an other candidate or somebody else that they're thinking of, Mike Pence, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, etc., when we saw people start to shift and consider other nominees besides Donald Trump when they were up against a potential matchup between Trump and others, it was clear to me, at least on the side of the political analysis spectrum, that voters there weren't going to vote for Trump because it was Donald Trump running again. They refused to support him even when the opportunity was just potentially another Republican. And those who stuck with him were the ones that were going to be his ride or dies, the ones that were going to be with him throughout the entirety of the campaign season, regardless of who decided to run. But the fact that there was any pushback against him when he won renomination in 2020 with well over 95% of the vote, it was clear then, at least, that the voters were very consolidated behind him. They had no concerns about his electability. They thought that he was a good president on the Republican side. But when we saw the initial numbers for 2024, his chances dipped down tremendously because there were voters already saying, even if given the opportunity to vote for Trump again, they would not take that chance in 2024. So now that we have all of that in mind, what we are seeing is that on the surface level, it looks good. But as I said, when it comes down to narrowing up between two candidates, notably DeSantis and Trump, Donald Trump loses. This new poll from Harris and Harvard University have Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump within 4 points of each other, with Ron DeSantis actually defeating Donald Trump in a head-to-head matchup. But the interesting thing about this all, when you look at the poll that considered many other candidates here, some of which very closely associated with President Trump, Nikki Haley, Ted Cruz, Mike Pompeo, Tim Scott, members of his cabinet or some of his closest advisors or allies in Congress, even when you take them out of the equation, not any of those voters shift over to Donald Trump. It's this phenomenon that we have seen where these voters want somebody else, and they will take somebody else over Donald Trump. It's not as if they are saying, okay, well, I want it to be Mike Pence, but if it's not Pence, then I'm going to Trump. No. The issue about Trump's base and the issue about Trump building this following around him that is entirely reliant on his persona, on his ability to sway these voters, is that because they are so locked in, it pushes out so many other groups of voters. It pushes out those people that say, okay, I would choose Nikki Haley, even though Nikki Haley was one of Trump's closest advisors and a huge member of his administration. They do not shift over to vote for Trump. And the problem is that he needs their votes. Because when given the opportunity between DeSantis and Trump, quite literally every single one of these voters shift over to DeSantis. Every single one. Now, it's not always the case. It can't take just any Republican. When I say other, I mean someone of notable status. Tim Scott is a senator from South Carolina who was faced up against Trump in a 1-to-1 matchup. Realistically, I don't think this would happen, but it's fun to build hypotheticals, and that's exactly what they did. In this matchup, Trump wins by 42. But realistically, we know Ron DeSantis is that big and bold challenger that Donald Trump is very much afraid of running against. Donald Trump has already started to attack Ron DeSantis, and last summer of 2021, Donald Trump floated the possibility of Ron DeSantis being his vice presidential nominee. The problem is, I don't think Ron DeSantis wants to be vice president. I think Ron DeSantis wants to be president, and that has become increasingly more clear as the months have progressed. Should Ron DeSantis announce a bid against Donald Trump, there's no guarantee that Donald Trump even survives that primary. And the fascinating thing about this all is that despite this hyperfixation or this huge discussion about DeSantis or Trump, only one of those candidates has actually announced that they are running for president, Donald Trump. And has he received a boost as a result of announcing his bid? In a way, maybe, but not really much in terms of overall movement. The average has remained roughly the same. That announcement really didn't mean much when almost everyone knew that he was going to run. The problem for Ron DeSantis? Not everybody knows that he's going to run, and he doesn't seem to be the only one that is considering a bid, as many of these other candidates are still openly floating it. But as people begin to drop, these voters that were going to choose somebody else over Trump are going to look for a new home. And that new home takes human form in Governor Ron DeSantis. I think also what we fail to realize, or at least not necessarily us, I think it's something that we talk about on a very, very broad level, but what I think Donald Trump and his campaign fails to realize is that the expectation is that DeSantis wins the nomination. I think the expectation here, even knowing that Donald Trump has announced, is that Ron DeSantis still decides to challenge him and ends up winning. Now, this would be the fault of Donald Trump, who propelled Ron DeSantis to victory in that Republican primary. He could have chosen Adam Putnam or somebody else to win that nomination. But what happened was that Donald Trump handed Ron DeSantis the Florida governor election. Sure, Ron DeSantis did that general election on his own, but in the primary very much was propelled by that Trump endorsement. And now it looks like that's going to be his own downfall. You see, the problem is that Donald Trump gave Ron DeSantis this platform, applauded him, praised him, and now that he's switching up on him before Ron DeSantis even decides to announce his bid for the presidency, well, it is very clear that Donald Trump is afraid of him, and that his advisors are afraid of him as well. In fact, we are already starting to see leaked press reports that Trump is in trouble. Insiders are worried about Ron DeSantis, and quite frankly, they should be. We see the numbers come in. For the first time on the national level, Donald Trump is losing a matchup against another candidate. When you look at all of the other candidate matchups nationwide, Ron DeSantis never ends up winning. Even in the circumstance where it is very, very close, Donald Trump almost always edges him out. But what we are starting to see now, what is reflective of what we have seen on some statewide polls, is that Ron DeSantis is now the favorite, even against Donald Trump. And there are heavy ramifications for that for the Democratic Party, but that's worth discussing in another video, because this focus is on the GOP, on the party that was unapologetically pro-Trump that now seems to be shifting further and further away from him. The time frame at which Donald Trump was soaring easily to this nomination is now at a halt, and it looks like the polls are getting closer and closer and closer to a point where they're converging, and we don't know concretely as to who is in the lead. Looking at the overall average, sure, Donald Trump enjoys an advantage. That's something that we cannot take away from him, and it absolutely is true. But the problem remains here for Donald Trump, is that the majority of voters prefer somebody else over him. The majority of voters prefer to choose a different candidate instead of him. And when given the opportunity between DeSantis and himself, voters choose DeSantis. That is Donald Trump's fundamental problem here, because many of these candidates, quite frankly, are not going to run, and they aren't going to endorse Trump. We have already started to see apprehension on the Republican side in terms of endorsements. I want us to take a quick look at the endorsements that Donald Trump has received, because quite frankly, there isn't many. Even Tucker Carlson has openly said he refuses to endorse in this election. Mike Pence has received an endorsement. Mike Pompeo has received an endorsement. So has Larry Hogan. Ron DeSantis has received quite a few. He's received the endorsement of Cynthia Lummis, U.S. Senator from Wyoming, who previously endorsed Trump. Mo Brooks, a representative from Alabama, who also endorsed Ron DeSantis. But what we are seeing in terms of his endorsements, sure, a significant amount. But that list of U.S. representatives is quite few. It's not as much as he had by any means in 2020, and it doesn't even seem to rival what he had in 2016. A lot of these members of Congress are some of the more extreme candidates, some of the more extreme, extreme representatives that are part of the House Freedom Caucus or are members of Trump's original team. In terms of U.S. senators, all he has is Tommy Tuberville. Not even those who go to bat for him in every single way that they can. Not even those who campaigned alongside him in 2020. And that tells us everything that we need to know. That Donald Trump is not reeling in the endorsements that he needs. He is not hitting the polling numbers that he needs, and his campaign is worried. Quite frankly, they should be. Ron DeSantis now seems to be preparing for a 2024 bid by taking on more and more conservative views rather than pivot to the middle, rather than try to focus on winning an election. I think Ron DeSantis, now that he has gotten through his Florida governor election, no longer is at all worried about that re-election bid. Immediately after winning his election by nearly 20 points, Ron DeSantis immediately shifted to a 6-week ban on abortion across the state, immediately shifted to be against vaccines, to be apprehensive towards COVID-19 and protocol, even though we know that he has always been very much about keeping businesses open, keeping the state open, less loose restrictions, etc., 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 etc. We've known this about Ron DeSantis, but now he's taking a turn significantly to the right, and a lot of it seems to be intentional as he prepares for 2024. Because those who vote in primaries are amongst the most conservative, at least on the Republican side. Those who vote in primaries are amongst those more polarized. And they are going to want to see a nominee and a candidate that takes positions that are of the right-wing ideology to at least somewhat of an extreme. And I think that's exactly what Ron DeSantis is doing. Joe Biden is vulnerable. Democrats know this. They know this favorability rating is not a good look for the president of the United States, and Democrats also are terrified. I think that constitutes another video to talk about the possibility that Joe Biden runs against Ron DeSantis and what that would mean for the two candidates in their potential matchup. But the takeaway here is that Donald Trump is losing. Donald Trump is losing ground. He's losing support. He's losing endorsements. He's losing practically everywhere. And this campaign has only just begun. This 2024 nomination, in every regard, is Donald Trump's nomination to lose, and it looks like that starting chance, that starting position where he is in the point of the beginning of the end, has started now. His numbers have decreased. His fundraising numbers aren't hitting the numbers that it needs to. He's failing to capture any major endorsements. All we are seeing is failure from the Trump campaign. And it's only going to continue to push and push and push Governor Ron DeSantis to announce his bid for President of the United States. And as are the expectations with many, many people, it is very possible that he trounces Donald Trump in that head-to-head matchup and wins nationwide and faces Joe Biden in the 2024 presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.